It looks like most people are starting to slowly trickle in, so we can get started. So first off, I want to welcome everybody to tonight's virtual talk with Dr. Suzanne Simard on her book, Finding the Mother Tree. So this event is a event that has been part of the Arboretum Expo, and we're partnering with the bookshelf as well, where you can buy copies of Suzanne's book, which is fantastic. Well, we'll do a bit of an introduction so you get to put some names to our faces. So here we have Suzanne Simard, of course, the author of Finding the Mother Tree. We have Barb Minette, who is from the bookshelf as well. And we have Justine Richardson, who is the director of the Arboretum. And my name is Kitty. I'm one of the naturalist interns here, along with Michelle, our other naturalist intern. And we're here to help facilitate this event. So if you guys have any technical issues or anything like that, feel free to ask us or message us directly in the chat. We'll try our best to help you out with that. But just a couple of housekeeping things before we jump right into it. I'll pass it over to Justine to do our land acknowledgement maybe afterwards, but just to let you guys know that this event will be recorded. So in the events that you guys are having any technical issues viewing anything, we will have the recording sent to you guys for an opportunity to watch it afterwards as well. And as a part of this Zoom webinar, your video and audios are disabled. So you don't have to worry about your camera being on or off or anything like that. But if you have any comments, feel free to enter it into the chat, or we will have a period where we'll be able to open up for public questions to ask Dr. Suzanne Simard as well at the very end. So if you have any questions that you would like us to answer, then at the very bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A option. If you click on that, you can enter questions through there, and we will hopefully try to filter out and pick out some good ones to ask at the end. And now with that, I'll pass it over to Justine.
Thank you so much, Kitty. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Suzanne Simard, for joining us. This is the first event of our Arb Expo, and Barb Minette brought the idea before your book was even published yet, and she had an advanced copy and had read it and reached out to do an event here with the Arboretum, and the perfect timing was here for our Arb Expo, which in some years has been a massive outdoor plant sale, which can't happen that way. We have a virtual online auction happening right now as part of the Arb Expo. But this is the first event, and I'm here at the Arboretum Center on the Arboretum ground, and want to take a minute opening the weekend of events for our land acknowledgement, which we offer as a step towards understanding and reconciling the past with our Indigenous neighbors, friends, and colleagues, and moving forward towards a shared future. The land where the Arboretum now grows has been home to plants and animals for millions of years, and it was home to Indigenous peoples long before settlers arrived, including Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We recognize the Between the Lakes treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which the University of Guelph and the Arboretum now sit. And we recognize the spirit of the Dish with One Spoon covenant over this territory, and the teachings that it represents, that there's one earth that we must all equitably share and protect. Recognizing the living history of this place and our relations in it is one part of our efforts to understand the land, our role to care for the flora and fauna that call it home now, and to contribute to a positive sense of culture and identity for the peoples who live here. As a green space in particular, and a land-based hub here at the university that's dedicated to research and teaching and community engagement right beside campus, we are committed to walking step by step with our Indigenous colleagues and researchers, students, community members, and partner organizations as we move together towards seeking and learning truth, seeking reconciliation, and braiding knowledges for a better future together. And Dr. Suzanne Simard's book really touches on some of these very issues of knowledges, where it comes from, how long have we had it, how do we come about it? And it's been wonderful to read this book and see the resonance that it's had with people. I'm thinking about how to introduce you. You have a TED Talk. You've been just meteorically taking off in terms of the resonance that your work and your way has had with people. But I wanted to reflect on an interaction I had with someone who reached out to us here at the Arboretum because she was working on a sign for her yard. And she had been inspired 20 years before from a workshop that she had attended here at the Arboretum on tree ID. And she'd been really inspired by this. And 20 years later, it had still been in her head. And she was working on a sign for her yard in a neighborhood in Stratford, Ontario. And this workshop she'd been to, doing all the tree ID, at the very last day, someone asked, it was led by Henry Koch, who was our former horticulturalist here, a longtime horticulturist here at the Arboretum. And somebody asked a question at the very end, when is the best time to rake up all the leaves and bundle them up? Like, when should we do that? And apparently Henry paused and said, what happens in the forest? And that question had resonated with her and inspired her 20 years later. And working with trees is a long-term endeavor. And this is a question that occurs to me that you have been thinking about as a person and a human and a researcher and a scientist your whole life. And now you've written this beautiful book about it. So we want to hear from you reading this book. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'd like to turn it over and ask you to talk to us about your book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justine. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you, Kitty, too, for your introduction to this overall webinar. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's my honor to be here. And I just want to acknowledge, too, that I'm actually living in Nelson, British Columbia, which is just on the west side of the Rocky Mountains. That's where I'm speaking to you from today. This is on the unceded territory of 3 nations, the Sinaiaks, the Ktunaxa, and the Okanagan nations. And I just also wanted to recognize their rights, their treaty, the rights and title and unresolved treaties of these people, our neighbors, our colleagues, and also to recognize that all the work that I've done over all these years in British Columbia, it crosses many, many nation territories, from not just the Ktunaxa and the Sinaiaks, but the Shepamek, the Sekine, the Haida, the Tsimshian, the Nichanlith, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the many, many nations that we live with, that have contributed to our knowledge, that have their own knowledge systems and their languages that reflect this cohesion among us all, this interconnectedness that makes us a human society, a society that lives with our kin, with our trees, our animals, all creatures on this earth that make this a livable and beautiful planet. And some of those words, they are getting lost with the languages, but the First Nations are working so hard to recover these words that we don't have in the English language, that describe phenomenon that I've spent a whole book trying to describe, where in these hidden languages there are words that encompass so many of these threads. One of the words that comes to mind is a Coast Salish word in the Homokamam group of languages, and that word is netsamatst. That word means we are one. And I think whether you're Maori, whether you're Homokamam language, whether you're Haida, there are words that reflect that connectedness throughout. So I came to this, of course, as a scientist, and I thought that I would just spend a moment reading a little bit about one of my experiments. This is my PhD experiment that really got me some recognition and got me to the point where I wanted to write it out in a book form that everybody could read, not just in a journal article. So here I'm gonna read to you. It's from the chapter called Radioactive. It's on page 353 that I'm going to start, and I'm gonna skip around a little bit so that I don't spend too long on this, but this is kind of an exciting moment in my life. So here we go. The day had come when we were ready to label the seedlings. It was warm out in the clear cut. and even hotter inside my plastic suit. At the first set of triplets, I took the tent off a Douglas fir seedling and placed a tomato cage over it and a second one over the paper birch seedling nearby, and leaving the cedar tree open, out in the open. The cages were to serve as frames for the plastic labeling bags, ensuring that the bags stay inflated during the labeling period when I was going to inject them with carbon-14 and carbon-13. With the cages up, we were ready for the moment I'd been planning and waiting for the past year, ever since I first planted these seedlings in the ground, to see if birch and fir traded carbon, whether they communicated with each other through below ground networks. It felt like a defining juncture, whether my intuition was right that collaboration in forests was just as important to its vitality as competition. And if so, I had a big responsibility to stop the madness of the wholesale removal of other native plants, these competitors. So over the top of the first set of tomato cages, we draped gas-tight sampling bags, as though placing a curtain over a parrot cage, completely covering the individual birch and the individual fir. We sealed the bottom of the bags around the stems of the seedlings and the legs of the cages with duct tape, making sure there were no leaks. Immediately before the last strip of duct tape was battened down, Dan, my assistant, reached inside one of the bags and taped a frozen vial of radioactive sodium bicarbonate. He carefully injected lactic acid into the frozen radioactive solution using a large glass syringe inserted into a porthole in the bag. Once he plunged the needle into the portal, the acid slowly dripped into the frozen vial, releasing carbon-14 labeled CO2 for the paper birch seedlings to absorb through photosynthesis. In the meantime, I was back at the tent, extracting 50 milliliters of C13 CO2 from the corncob cylinder into my own syringe so I could inject it into the other bag covering the Douglas fir. I was sweating so profusely that my goggles kept fogging up, and I waddled from triplet to triplet, making my injections while Dan made his. Mosquitoes and flies swarmed like dust around me. Dan moved swiftly between the triplets in our lab bench, where he kept the vials of radioactivity frozen in liquid nitrogen. I lagged behind as I slowly extracted each syringe of CO2 at the lab bench, then shuffled to the next triplicate. After leaving the seedlings to absorb the labeled CO2 for a couple of hours, we vacuumed out any potential excess isotope and then we pulled off the bags. Whatever traces of gases that might have remained were quickly carried into the gentle breeze out into the atmosphere. The bags off, Dan ran back to the lab tent to escape the clouds of bugs. I waddled as fast as I could behind him, zipped the door closed, and tore off my plastic armor. Like a surgeon, Dan peeled off his latex gloves and dropped them into the garbage bag of used gear. We stared at each other. "We did it," I exclaimed. Dan said, "Well, maybe. We needed to check the seedlings with the Geiger counter." "Right," I said. I pulled my plastic suited surgical gloves back on, grabbed the Geiger counter, and raced back out to the closest triplet. The breeze had picked up and the leaves of the birch seedlings were whiffling around their twirling petioles, the fir leaning steadily into the air currents. Across the lake, storm clouds were piling up like inky cap mushrooms. A squirrel ran in front of me and stopped on a stump to watch. I lifted the Geiger counter up to the leaves of the carbon-14 labeled birch. I held my breath. Were they radioactive? If not, then all of our preparations were for naught. If the donors hadn't absorbed the radioactive CO2, then we wouldn't know if they could then transmit organic carbon to the neighboring firs. Dan appeared next to me, looking anxious. I flicked on the switch. A crackle sang from the wand. Dan's face lit up. The hand on the meter swung to the right, showing a high radiation count. "Oh, good. I did it right," Dan said, relieved. "Do you think we'll be able to detect any in the fir neighbors?" I asked. I doubt it," he said. It's only been a few hours since we started labeling. Trained to be cautious with early results. Based on David Reed's study, it would likely take a few days for the radioactivity to transmit below ground from the birch to the fir. Even if it did move into the neighbor, the amount would probably be below the detection of the Geiger counter, and we would have to wait for results until we ran samples at the lab. But what would it hurt to check with the Geiger counter now? We could try to get a reading in advance just to see if there might be a hint that the Douglas fir needles held the answers. I calmed myself down. I was sure Dan was right. He knew more about labeling plants than almost anybody. But what the heck? It cost nothing to try. I instinctively walked to the neighboring fir and knelt down. Dan couldn't help but follow me, and he leaned over my shoulder. We both inhaled the piercing scent of fir needle resin. And for a moment, I forgot about the years of difficult work and bouts of frustration. I brushed my hand over the end of the wand to make sure nothing was there to mask the signal. The moment of truth had come. The conductor, in my mind, raised her hands to the orchestra. The ensemble readied their instruments. Tilting my ear towards the stem, I ran the Geiger counter over the fir's needles. My wrist lifted slightly in an upbeat, and my Geiger counter wand crackled faintly as the dial on the meter swung up a tad. Strings and woodwinds, brass and percussion exploding as one, flooding my ears. The movement, allegro and intense, concordant and magical. I was enraptured, focused, immersed, and the breeze sifting through the crowns of my little birches and firs and cedars seemed to lift me clear up. I was part of something much bigger than myself. I shot a look at Dan, his mouth frozen open. Dan, I cried, did you hear that? He just stared at the Geiger counter, silent. He'd wanted with his whole heart for the labeling to work. And what we were hearing from the fir was beyond anything we had expected. We were listening to birch communicate with fir. And with that, I'll leave you with that to read the rest yourselves.
Okay. Hi, Suzanne. That was so exciting. After just so many of your experiments were so tedious and so labor intensive. So that must have been just like quite a moment.
It was. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very important work, Suzanne. I really believe that it will win the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction this year.
Wow.
I have to no, I think it will. I have to confess that there were moments in the book when I was actually crying. Other moments when I really had to concentrate to take in the science of your research. Years ago, I read The Golden Spruce by John Valen. It really opened my eyes to the world of corporate tree takeover. I was also amazed by it because he included the personal and the political. But your book has gone even further in creating a living document of your life that straddles love of nature, corporate farming, and academia, but most importantly, your own personal journey. You didn't shirk the science, and you didn't shirk your personal journey. It's really unusual. So my question is, there's 2 or 3 questions in here. Why did you decide to write it this way? And what kind of push-pull was there from your editor and publisher? And how nervous were you about revealing the ups and downs and frustrations of your life?
What an outstanding question. Thank you for that. You know, I mean, I'm a scientist. I'm a professor. My life is about doing science and publishing my work. And I've published literally over 200 articles in peer-reviewed journals. I'm also a forester and of course a citizen of the world. And I've been in forestry for decades and watched things not change. You know, forests change all the time, but we as people and our ability to move forest policy, forest practices is woefully slow. And so I felt like all this work I'd done over these decades, this important work that should shift how we view forests. In the corporate eye, it is, you know, a bunch of trees that produce wood that we can then harvest for money. And you know, and the idea is to manage them so that they grow fast so we can cut them sooner. And it literally is as simple as that. And I thought, you know, there's so much more to forests, and we're missing so much from this very narrow view of how forests work, what their importance is in our life, like our lives. I mean, they create oxygen, they clean our water, they provide us food, they provide us homes, they balance our climate, for Pete's sakes. and yet we're treating them like they're just commodities. And so I thought, well, my journal articles aren't making any difference whatsoever as an academic, right? And so I thought, I've got to reach the public myself. They're not going to read the journal articles. The policymakers aren't reading them. Even if I talk to them, they're still not going to listen. So I thought, I've got to take this directly to the public and say, look, here is the story. Now I need you to do your work and push your governments to change. And so I needed to write it in a way that everybody could read it. Everybody can own this story. It's a human story, right? I'm just no different than anybody else. I have my ups and downs. I have my tragedies and loves, and I wanted people to, know that and relate to it. And then as they read this story, to absorb that science as though it's just like, oh, it's so interesting to read that at the same time, without having to work at it. And so that's why I wrote the book, is to reach people. What was it like, because I set out to do that in the first place, even before I got an editor, before I got a publisher, that was part of what I wanted to do anyway. So it wasn't that hard for me to get to that point. I think that one of the hard parts was in creating the story arc, learning how you do that so that it's exciting and keeps you moving. That I learned a lot from that. I actually had a writing coach who helped me with that. Her name is Catherine Voss, and she's a wonderful writer and coach. And so I learned the cadence of telling a story like this to keep readers engaged. And of course, it took me a year to write this book. It was not easy at all. It completely absorbed all of me for that year. But I love it. I love it too. So I'm very happy with it.
Aren't we lucky? So was your writing coach, she wasn't from Random House?
No. So here's here's a funny thing that happened. So I took a sabbatical to write this book, and I wasted the first 4 months, twiddling my thumbs, going to Chile, like avoiding it. And then I sat down on January 1st and I said, okay, you've got to start. And so I sat down and I've written like 100 outlines, it seemed like, and I realized as I was about to write the first page or paragraph that I didn't know what I was doing, right? I didn't really know if my story arc worked. And then I got a phone call from this guy, Doug Abrams, who is a literary agent who has developed his own company called Idea Architects. And he works with like scientists or academics like me who have an idea and they want to get it into a readable book, and they help you do that, and they find a publisher and they provide a coach. And so he phoned me up and he said, I'd seen your TED Talks and I love the story, we'd like to work with you. And so then, then they helped me. And and that was honestly, that was a wonderful thing. It was probably the best thing I ever did, was join into that relationship with them.
Interesting.
And
Okay, well, I know that you have worked with First Nations groups in British Columbia for a long time. Can you tell us about your experiences working outside of the cultures of academia and the Western scientific model?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's such an important question. Like Western science is new, right? We talk about, when we talk about Western science, we're really only talking about a few hundred years of thought of with starting with Plato and Descartes and and moving into Darwinism, and like that's pretty recent history. And the development of Western science really was about separating the mind from the body, man from nature, being objective, being very precise and objectively observe, reporting your results, peer review, which is important. And really dissecting things down to their parts, being very reductionist. And this is different than Indigenous science. Indigenous science starts, I think, with a worldview, is that we're all connected, instead of that we're all separate and reducible to parts, right? A completely different worldview. And so it was kind of easy for me to work with that, because I grew up in forests, like as a little kid. I grew up in a family that was a logging family, a horse logging family. So I just grew up among the roots and the trees and the huckleberries and the thimbleberries, and it was a natural thing for me. I knew the forest as a system already in my gut, in my bones, in my DNA. And so it was easier for me to work with the Aboriginal worldview than the Western science worldview, which I always found troublesome and difficult. And so then when I started working with them, I realized too that, they start with the bigger principles of we're connected, and that we need to respect the environment, that what we do to the environment, which by the way, they don't see themselves as different than the environment, they are that, but that what we do, we get back, right? What we do to nature, we do to ourselves, as was famously said, I think, by Aldo Leopold. So it wasn't hard for me, but I have to say that, in thinking in these larger principles, it's harder in some ways to do the science the way that we do it in Western culture, to try to understand these big systems, because we're always trying to shove it into these experimental designs and analytical techniques that don't really work for big systems level thinking. And so I've had to learn systems level analysis in order to analyze results from the Western world, and to try to publish it in Western journals, which by the way, still don't pay attention to Indigenous science. And it's also, because culture and art and science are all intertwined as one, what in complexity science we call those emergent properties, they don't actually find their ways into journal articles. We miss all that part through reductionist science. And so we miss sort of all the interstitial agents that glue things together. And so, yeah, that part has been hard, but the actual philosophical part for me has not been hard at all. And it's been enriching and wonderful to work with Indigenous people who have their heads screwed on right. They know what their goals are. They know what's important. And, thank goodness they're here, and they're vibrant, and they're not going to give up, and neither are we. And we all are going to braid together, as Justine so lovely said at the beginning.
Well, okay. So I'm wondering what's happened to the BC government, the policymakers who don't seem to understand these things like we thought they might.
You're so right. Today, I'm actually, even before I came on, I'm writing an op-ed to the Vancouver Sun, because I'm horrified too. Because right now, the RCMP is at Fairy Creek, which, by the way, is the biggest civil disobedience act in all of Canadian history since the history of Canada, since we became a confederation. And it's being largely ignored by the major media, I would say. Like CBC has not done good reporting on it. That's why I want to write this op-ed. But the provincial government, like, what are we thinking? We're out there arresting elders, kids, regular people who just care about the forest and the environment, and we're throwing them in jail. I mean, literally today, there was an elder woman, probably like 70 years old, drove up to Fairy Creek to support the kids. She got pulled out of her car by the RCMP, and Teal Jones ran their backhoe over her car and crushed it. I mean, it's freaking barbaric, right? So, I get what you're saying. Like, I agree. Like, why doesn't the government get this? Like, we're interconnected systems. We need to protect them, respect them, treat them as though we treat our own children. And yet, we're not doing that. What is it going to take? I don't know.
Well, if you don't know, who does? Well, anyway, keep writing those op-eds. Okay, I had another question about the future. I kind of shudder when I hear politicians saying we're going to plant 1 billion trees, because I understand from reading your book what monoculture is, and that's probably what will happen, I imagine, unless they have someone like you telling them what to do. So what is your feeling about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so complex, but the first thing is, great idea. I'm glad that Trudeau and these governments are thinking about global change and climate change, and we need to mitigate this. I mean, if we don't act, well, we have to act. We have no choice. But they're getting on board, but they can't forget that number one, that our old forests, our primary forests, are the biggest storehouse of carbon in our terrestrial ecosystems. Old growth forests like Fairy Creek, there's more carbon in Fairy Creek than per hectare than a tropical rainforest on our own Pacific West Coast. And, and so saving these old forests is the number one thing that we need to do. We're not doing that, but we need to do that. And so people need to be pushing their governments and saying, no, this is wrong. And so that's number one. Then planting trees. Okay, so if it's deforested or we need to restore a forest that's been degraded, then yes, we can plant trees. But it can't be at the expense or in excuse for cutting down old forests, because there's no amount of tree planting that's going to make up for all that carbon storage in our old growth forests. And yes, you're absolutely right. When we plant it, we've got to do it right? We can't just put in a monoculture or put in the wrong genotype or, or afforest a place that shouldn't have a forest on it because it will mine more carbon out of the soil than it puts in the soil. I mean, all those big mistakes can be made, and they will be made if we're not careful. We've done it before, we can make mistakes again. So yeah, we have to get the best minds that know about forests, including all of our Indigenous people who want to contribute to this, get our heads on this and do it properly. But the first priority has got to be in saving the existing old growth forests that we have already.
Well, you are the mother tree, so you have to send out through your mycorrhizal network all this information. I don't know, but
it just takes, people can learn this, right? Like I've spent my whole life in forests. I learned, what species belong where, what belongs in the creek, what belongs on the mountaintop, what species go together, which are companions. And we can learn this. It just takes, putting people on the land, giving them the resources to make a living from that, and learning and watching and adapting. That's how you do it. It's just a slow process, but it's enriching. It's a beautiful life to have, and we can do that.
Join hands. We have to join hands. And okay, the forestry industry could be used as a metaphor for our whole culture, where competition, not cooperation, is king. Are we at a turning point? Are policymakers listening to you now? Would you say?
If they did, I wouldn't be writing op-eds, I guess.
That's true.
I would say no. I mean, the fact that I grew up in a province of old growth and I now live in a province of clear cuts, and I've been doing this work for 40 years, tells me that no, they haven't been listening. I think that people on the ground, like the foresters as individuals, know this, but
okay.
When they work for big institutions, whether it's in government or industry, so yeah, I mean, I think that, as individuals, we need to take responsibility, but we also, need to realize that our governments, they have such a broad influence through policy that it can undo any individual's good efforts. And so we really need to be pushing our governments to do the right thing, to listen to scientists, but listen to Indigenous people, listen to all of us. Like if the public is saying don't cut old growth forests and do a proper job of forest management, well, they need to put money into doing that. And they've instead been pulling money out of this resource management and and really racing to the bottom, doing it as cheaply as possible. And we can't afford to do that anymore. We've got to put effort and money and resources into looking after our resources.
But do you feel that some of the companies are being more sustainable now than they have been in the past?
I think that there's a desire to, but it's only that desire can only be actualized if the public pushes them. Like I said, the individual foresters, they are well educated, they know, they see what's going on, but then they get hamstrung by their companies, which are always trying to, they're governed by economics and the quarterly report. And so that means cutting costs and extracting as much value out of what they do cut as possible, or, I don't know, they're trying to compete on the existing marketplace. And so it gets drowned out. But those individuals are pushing and the public is pushing. And so, for example, in British Columbia, the government has this thing called BC Timber Sales, which is run like a corporation, but it's government owned. It used to be called the Small Business Program. They do nothing but clear cutting and planting monocultures. But now they've said in the last month or two, said we need to move towards partial cutting, which means leaving old mother trees. And the only reason that they're doing that is because the public is pushing them. So I can't emphasize enough that we need an informed public, we need educated people, and we need to be active. We need to be active with our governments and making sure that we hold them their feet to the fire, that they can't abrogate on their promises, you know, that they actually do what they say they're going to do. Our NDP government said it was going to protect old growth. It's not doing that at all. It's doing the opposite. So we need to hold them to task. We can't just let them get away with it, I guess. We have to be active citizens.
So that is why you have to win the Governor General's Award this year.
Thank you.
Okay, well, our time is almost up. Thank you so much again for this incredible book. I'm not kidding everyone. It's just, it's like, it has everything in it. It'll really leave you stunned and amazed, especially by all the hard work, like all that driving up the highway back and forth from your home to the university, all of your different experiments. They're just, it's just an incredible life.
Thank you.
I did want to mention that the Bookshelf Cinema is opening finally September 17th. And the movie that we're opening with is a documentary, The Hidden Life of Trees.
Cool.
So thank you again, Suzanne. And I guess it's Q&A time.
Thank you, Barb.
Thank you, Barb. That is fantastic news. I've heard about that movie and have been wanting to see it. Have you seen it yet, Suzanne?
No, I haven't. I have not been part of that, but that's great. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're going to switch to the Q&A part. So the Q&A is open. And so if you're in the audience, some people have started sending questions already. So you can probably see them, Suzanne, but we'll feed them to you. I thought maybe we would start with this question. We talked about tree planting, kind of a technical question. Is there a metric for planting trees? How many trees, how many species in a given area? Is there some objective standard?
That's a great question. You know, that's what foresters do, right? So, foresters by training, in Western training, we do two things. We plant trees and we cut trees, and then we plant more trees and cut more trees. That's a standard forestry practice. So the planting of trees is very much a part of the science and art of forestry. And what you plant, how much you plant, needs to be guided by the local ecosystem. And so where I come from in British Columbia, we have this wonderful ecosystem classification system. It's very detailed. It's based on probably 30 years of concerted effort by the government. I've dissed the government, you know, the current government a lot, but they've also done a lot of good things. And one of the things is they developed this ecosystem classification where for 30 years, scientists like myself, I was involved in this too as a young scientist, went out and just, you know, described plant communities all over, from mountaintops to bogs to swamps to mesic forests all through the province, and came up with this very detailed classification system. And married with that classification system are all the tree species, of course, that grow there. We describe the species, the soils, and so on. So we know what all the natural tree species are in all these different ecosystems, and it's well documented, well published. And so then there are guidelines that have been built up by the government on what to plant. And so, you know, there'll be a selection of species that you can choose from. You know, so if a site hosts 10 species naturally, they'll recommend maybe the top 3 and say, oh, you could also mix it with a few others. One of the things that happens, unfortunately, is that companies will pick the fastest growing tree species and only plant that one species because it's cheapest and that gets them to a forest faster. And there's all kinds of policies that will support that. But the basic idea here is that the foundation is well laid, that we have really great information about what to plant, what occurs there naturally. And then as far as densities and spacing and all that goes, again, like it's too easy to fall back on the recipe of, you know, 2.5 meter spacing, but really in ecosystems, it's very variable. You know, it depends on where a seed lands, how good that site is. And we are not that good at mimicking that natural variability in spatial arrangement of trees. So we have a long ways to go on that, but there are places to start. And I think you get started on your piece of land and try with the best knowledge that you have that's well published, and then try it and then move things around and see how it's like planting a garden and then following it and learning from it. It's the same thing in a forest.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So just one note to the audience, please do send your questions. You also can do a thing called upvoting. So if you click the little thumbs up for a question that you want answered, it'll put it up to the top and it's easier for me to see which one it is. Thank you. So here's a question. It's astounding how long it's taken Western cultures to begin to accept that we're responsible for the climate crisis. How do you maintain your optimism for the future with political systems being so opposed to caring for the earth?
Yeah, I just want to, that's a great question. I just want to address one question that I'm now, my mind is on the chat, and it says, what somebody wrote in here, The Hidden Life of Trees is based on a book not written by Dr. Simard. And I just wanted to clarify that you're absolutely right, Ron Lau, that I didn't write that book. That book was written by Peter Wallenben, who is in Germany. The only thing I did is that I wrote the foreword to the book, which ended up as the backward to the book, but otherwise I had nothing to do with writing that book. So that aside, how do I keep up my optimism? You know, I understand how systems work, right? Like ecosystems. I understand it's about, you know, after looking at and studying them for decades, my whole life, that it's all about the relationships between individuals and species. You know, it's the relationships that build an ecosystem. It's not about the parts. It's not about the trees alone. It's not about the soil alone. It's not about the plants alone. It's not about the bears alone. It's all of them working together. And all systems are like that. Even social systems, like human societies, are like that too, right? We make, you know, universities and hospitals and medical systems, teach education systems based on all of us working together. And it's out of that beautiful relationships that we create that we get these symphonies of creative work. And really the ecosystem is the same. And the forest ecosystem. And one of the properties of a system like that is that it's very resilient, right? All these relationships means that, with a diversity of different individuals, means that no one relationship is going to make or break you. But all are important, but it's not reliant on one individual relationship. It's many things, it's multifold. And so that builds in resilience in your system. That means if that one relationship breaks down, you've got others to build you up. So for example, if we lose one tree species in an ecosystem and there's 10 there, well, the other 9 can kind of fill in the gaps. That's resilience. And then these linkages, these relationships are multifaceted. So like when we, in a society, when we communicate, we have multiple ways of communicating. For example, we can use Zoom, or we can read a book, or we can do a lecture, or we can walk in the forest and communicate. Like, you know, the same thing in a forest, you know, a tree can interact with another tree through cooperation, through competition, through, you know, all kinds of interactions. And so that builds resilience into the system as well. Another property of systems like this is that they're very, you know, it's hard to destroy them when they're built so tough like that, right? It's hard to die as an individual when you've got all this beautiful vascular and nervous system and bone structure and hereditary system. It's hard to die. And so systems are built to live and heal. And so our ecosystems are the same, they're regenerative. And the way they work is that it could seem like the changes are imperceptible. So as we move towards a more climate-friendly future, decarbonize our energy sector, for example, restore our broken ecosystems, that it might seem imperceptible at first, the changes, but then we hit these tipping points, right? Suddenly you'll get changes. Those changes can be positive, they can also be negative. But the positive part is that we can rebuild systems. And once they get the foundational parts in them, they really take off and heal themselves. And so that, you know, that inherent intrinsic property of our biological systems, and that they're adaptive as well, they're biological systems, they heal, that gives me incredible hope. I know that we can solve this problem because of the way we're built.
That is so inspiring. Thank you. Can you make a tree plantation healthier by mixing companion species and inoculating the soil with appropriate fungi?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yes, absolutely. Like, trees don't grow in isolation, plants don't grow in isolation, they grow in communities. They're interdependent on each other. And a diverse community people who study biodiversity, they know that productivity, for example, the production of biomass or the health of a community is directly correlated with diversity. And the reason is that they help each other out. So for example, in a plantation, you might have a nitrogen fixing tree and a non-nitrogen fixing tree. That nitrogen fixing tree will add nitrogen to the soil without any artificial fertilizers, like an alder, for example. And then you might have another tree that's really good at bringing water up from deep in the subsoil, and it will share that water with its neighboring nitrogen fixing tree. And so they're kind of working together to increase the nitrogen capacity of the site and the water capacity of the site. And this is how the systems work. They work together to do that, those kinds of uplifting of the ecosystem. So yes, knowing the native mixtures, the ones that belong there together, is important. So you got to study the natural community composition and try to emulate that. And then if your system is degraded, so let's say you've got a parking lot and you want to convert it back to a forest. Well, if it's been left without any plants, any photosynthetic plant there for a long time, the fungi and bacteria in the soil start to die off because they're dependent on energy from those plants to feed them. Energy comes from photosynthate. And so that they slowly die off. And so in those cases, you do need to re-inoculate the soil with the life, because soil without life is just dirt. It's not a living thing. It's not a cycling thing. It needs to be re-enlivened. And so putting the plants back, re-inoculating with fungi and bacteria will really help those plants to get going. But once the plants are going, once they're established, they're going to create their own diversity in the soil. The spores and the bacteria will start coming in from the surrounding forest and repopulate that native soil. And so what we find, for example, in forests, if we go in and we plant a tree and we put some artificial or some fertilizer with some fungus in it, pretty soon that fungus that we introduced disappears because the native fungi have taken over. But that initial inoculation in that commercial inoculum was really important to get that plant going, to get it photosynthesizing so that it can support a broader, more diverse soil microbial community.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Here's another question. What do you think of the little forests using the Miyawaki method? This is being done in Kingston, Ontario, using native trees.
I don't know what that is. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, I'll have to pass over that.
Please, boys, tell us some more in the comment. How are the massive fires out west affecting the old growth forests?
Yeah, you know what? That's an excellent question. With climate change, we have more energy in our atmosphere. We have more lightning. And what we found in British Columbia this year is that unlike previous years where about half of the fires were started by humans and half by lightning, it's shifting more to lightning. And that's because of this incredible, the heating of the atmosphere from global change, the creation of lightning from the fires themselves, because we get these big mega fires. And so global change is really driving this greater intensity, extent, severity of fires. And also in tandem with that, fire suppression in forests has built up fuels. And so that's created even more fire risk. And forest management, in addition to that, forest management, so that the cutting of old trees, the removal of what I call mother trees, these old trees also increases the risk of fire and burning of landscapes, because these old trees, a lot of them are fire resistant. They have thick bark, they have deeper roots. And so when fire goes through in a lot of these ecosystems, it doesn't burn the old trees. And the old trees bring water up from below and keep it moist, right? They keep the ecosystem moist and alive. And so when we clear cut these old trees, we're actually reducing that resistance to the fire, for one, and then replacing them with conifers that are simple species compositions, and they're also very flammable. It just so happens that the conifers we plant back, they have high resin content, low water content. We weed out the birches and aspen, which are less flammable. And so we create this perfect storm. So a lot of these lightning strikes were actually starting fires in plantations, lightning strikes that were coming out of the the existing fires, starting new fires, spot fires in plantations, and then just rolling through the landscape. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that we know, and there's a lot of things we can do differently to mitigate the spread of fire through forest management. We can do a better job. We know enough to do that. But the number one thing, going back to my first comment, is we really need to address climate change, because, you know, if it's hot enough, anything is going to burn.
So true. We have a question from a student. There are a number of students online with us, I know. As a university student, I would love to know what steps you have taken. This is from Natalie. What steps you've taken in your education and in your career to get to where you are today?
That's a great question. I bumbled through it, just like everybody else. I mean, what are some of the key things? I persevered, and I think that Barb talked about that. Like, the stories are about perseverance, right? It's like putting your mind to it, sticking with your convictions. Like, if you know it's true, you care about it, then stick with it. And the other thing I think often about what my PhD supervisor said to me, and I take this to heart, is, you know, it's great to study small things, but think about the big picture all the time. I tell my daughters this: keep your eye on the big picture and put your efforts where you're going to make a difference, right? So it's okay to study some rare species that could make a huge difference. Yes, for sure, we need that too. But always keep in mind, how does this fit into the broader picture? How can we move the needle on the big picture items like global change, you know, water quality, you know, biodiversity? Like, those are all important. So thinking about the small and the big at the same time. And then I guess the other thing I would say, you know, especially for girls, like, we often get sidelined. We don't have the same opportunities. I mean, in certain fields we do, but forestry, it's been difficult. And I would say, and I had a lot of difficulty. And I would say, you know, don't stay down too long. Like, if you're not making it up in some pathway that you wanted to take, well, switch. You know, don't get beaten down. Just, you know, find another way and continue to pursue your goals, because there are always, just like in a system, there's many pathways to get to where you want to be.
That's what your book really illustrates that. Again, in an episode, the other thing that really comes forward in the way you write your book is your curiosity, the questions you have, the wonder that you bring, and you really express that well in the writing of your book, and that could
yeah,
really comes through, I think.
I think that's the thing, you know, that sometimes we get that, like in science, that kind of gets beaten out of you for a while when you're in university or grad school, or, you know, that you feel like you've got to toe the line and follow the literature and do the next thing that the literature tells you. But don't forget your intuition. That's super important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you got to follow your heart, follow what you think is important. And got to know your field, but don't let that confuse you, or let it inform you, but don't let it confuse you. And, you know, don't disregard your intuition, because often you are right? And if you're kind of off a little bit, you'll get there, right? Just keep going and you'll get there.
What an encouraging message. There are a couple questions about particular sort of the what can we do questions. There's one, would you give us some information about the Ancient Forest Alliance, and would it help to join this alliance? Another question a little bit down the chat, from here in Ontario, what could we do to help the folks in Fairy Creek, for example?
Yeah, well, the Ancient Forest Alliance is great. You know, it's been a strong voice. It's been a consistent voice. It's been there for the forest all along. The director, Michelle Connolly, she was actually one of the students in my class in forestry at UBC, but she's a strong, powerful woman. Contact her, ask her how you can help. And they need lots of help. A lot of it is just volunteer time. I know Michelle has got like 2 or 3 jobs going on just to support herself, so you can volunteer and help her out. And then as far as, you know, Fairy Creek itself, I think the Ancient Forest Alliance is probably taking donations. There are various websites, you can easily find them online, where you can donate money. You can write letters to your newspaper, write to your MP, your member of parliament. You know, if you're in Ontario, phone your MP and say, hey, I'm really appalled by what's going on at Fairy Creek. Or, you know, what do you mean? Why are we arresting kids and grandmothers when they're trying to protect our planet? Like, it doesn't make sense. So again, again, we've got to be active and political in our own little way, even if it's very small, but it all counts, it all matters. Because I think that the protesters sometimes, it's very, very, very difficult. Some of them have been out there for over a year, sleeping in tents, putting their lives on the line. They're exhausted, they're discouraged, they're traumatized. And if they know that they've got support of the Canadian people, that gives them incredible power and sticking power and propels them forward. So anything that you can do to support that in your way is really, really valuable.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, Lise is responding to that earlier question. It's a method started in Japan to reforest depleted areas in cities. So there's a lot about urban forestry. The soil is amended and native trees are very intensely planted, mimicking forest by planting different layers in the forest. It's quite successful in many other countries. She says in Kingston, it will be a bit different in that the soil is not deep enough to do the kind of soil amending that's usually done, I guess, in the Japanese method. They will amend the soil by covering degraded soil with leaves and wood chips and compost.
Okay, yeah, that sounds very fundamentally good. And I think I have heard of it. I just haven't explored it, and I couldn't remember the word, but yeah, like forests and plants, they grow in communities and they grow in healthy soil. So those are two things that you need, right? Healthy soil, so adding compost back, which contains the soil food web, and that cycles the nutrients in the water. You need that, and to create soil structure and porosity so that roots and plants can grow. So that's number one. It's like laying the foundation for your house. You need that foundation. And then planting back communities of plants. So as I said before, we grow, just like us, we grow in diversity. The plants need companions, they need their families, they need their community. That's what makes a vital ecosystem. So that's what they're trying to do. And that sounds like a really good approach. They've got the basics there.
Do you have any particular suggestions for reading resources about companion trees to plant in yards or schoolyards and public spaces?
There's a lot of books out there that have this information. I would say, for especially for your local ecosystems, like I said about my, in British Columbia, we have these beautiful ecosystem descriptions and classifications. And so I would start with that, to try to, if you want to restore to your native plant communities. And then other than that, there lots of people write about their local plant communities. I know that, I was reading a book out of the UK called Around the World in 80 Trees and Around the World in 80 Plants. And his name is John Drury. And he writes about all these beautiful trees and plants and how they grow together. And so there's lots of resources out there. So I guess I couldn't name any one single one for your area, but those resources exist. So go to your bookstore, go to your government websites, you'll find this stuff there.
And here at the Arboretum, we have workshops on a whole range of subjects. On Sunday, our horticulturist and Sean Fox and Sarah Farquharson are going to be leading a seed collection workshop, and they're going to be doing a half day on the grounds here, local seed collection from our collections and our seed banks that we have here at the Arboretum.
Cool. That's great.
We are coming to the end of our time. I didn't get to all the questions. Was there any that you saw come up on the side, Suzanne, that you really wanted to get to? If not, I think there's one I would maybe end with.
I can't. Yeah, I've only got a subset here. So no, I don't. I think I've only got the panelists on here.
So I'll connect these two then for our final question. Bill Morrison says, the issue as a person narrowing in on my 80th birthday is not learning what the Western world feels is vital, but it's the opportunity to experience and develop relationships with trees. How can we assist in this relationship? And then following on that, Lee says, which tree do you want to hug on your 100th birthday?
That's a great question. If I only make it to 100. So, just being in the forest is the number one thing to do. Or even if you don't have a forest, you have a park, or if you have a garden, is just go sit with your plants and or your trees. And I always take my students, I teach second year University Ecology, and we have this beautiful forest at our university. And I take these kids out to the forest, and we just lay on the forest floor for like 5 minutes and just listen. And I don't do this every year, but I try to do it as much as I can. And the first few minutes, the students are kind of fidgeting and they feel a bit uncomfortable and like they haven't been quiet like that for a long time, or they haven't looked at their phone, and it takes them a while to settle down. But after a couple minutes, it gets quieter and you start hearing the birds and the squirrels, and then people get quiet, and then they sort of sink into the forest floor, and then when the 5 minutes are up and I say, okay, it's 5 minutes, they're like, oh, they were completely enveloped in the forest. And it is that connection in that 5 minutes of silence that from that moment on, even if they've never spent a moment in the forest, they're connected and they can't wait to get back out there. And so those vital moments of being with a tree, with a plant, that's where that relationship starts. And it can mean just even sitting beside your daisy plant in your garden. Like it doesn't really take a tree, it just takes a plant, or even, it's all the creatures too, your kittens, your goldfish. But for plants, it's especially it's special because they're so they're in one spot. They don't take off, so it's easy for us to do that, and we just need to take the moment to be with them and feel them. And I remember, once I did this thing where I was in a workshop with a shaman, and we were doing this sort of drumming, and she said, I want you to, sit with a plant in your mind. And so I sat with the Douglas fir, which is what I study so much. And I guess when I'm 100, that's what I would like to do, is be with a Douglas fir. But immediately when she was drumming, I was inside the heartwood of that Douglas fir. It only took a second, and I was one with that tree. And anybody can do that, right? You're just in with the plants. You're just one of them.
What a wonderful challenge for you to leave us with. Thank you to get to know our trees matter and connect. Thank you so much for your energy today. Thank you to all members of the audience out there. We are so glad that you joined us today. If you are nearby, we think folks have joined from all over. If you're close enough, we have some other in-person programs that are going to happen over the weekend. Tomorrow night, we have a film that's going to be screened outside on the West Lawn here at the Arboretum. Called Borealis. It's a beautiful film about the boreal forest. On Saturday morning, we're having another virtual panel about ecosystem restoration. We're going to be talking about planting 1 billion trees and also some very local restoration efforts on a gravel pit that was part of this land here at the Arboretum before we started, in between 2 areas of old growth forest. So there was a question about old growth forest, and there are 2 parts of the Arboretum that we think are old growth forests. They certainly have never been clear cut, largely because they were too wet to plow. So they never got cleared for farmland in between them. And so over time, we've been refilling that space and reforesting the Arboretum between them. We have some walks that will be happening on Saturday afternoon, and then a piece that a panel presentation that'll also be in person on Saturday morning, led by an artist named Dawn Matheson, who's been doing a project called How to Draw a Tree, Trees, Mental Health, and Creativity. And she's been doing this very thing about connecting with an individual tree over the course of a year. So she'll be talking about that. So go to our website. I think Kitty will be putting it in the chat for everyone to see. The link so you can sign up. The registration is limited, of course, because of COVID, but please do join us. This talk will be online on our website and shared with other folks. So thank you very much, Suzanne, for joining us. Thank you to all of our wonderful audience. And we feel very optimistic from hearing from you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.